Good afternoon. Welcome to Sewing Shenanigans. Well, is it afternoon? Yeah. Well, good noon. It's welcome to Sewing Shenanigans with Brent and Becky. Today is going to be a very special episode of Sewing Badly with Brent. This is actually an idea I had for a YouTube live thing to do like years ago, but I never got around to doing it. I thought it would be kind of a fun like monthly thing to do, but nobody was watching, and doing it myself, talking to an empty room, was kind of a pain. But now I've got Eddie and Danny here to keep me entertained while I do this.
I used to talk to you.
Yeah, but this was before anybody was even here when I was doing this. What we're going to do today is make a quilt from start to finish. Kind of like Bob Ross, how he used to do the paintings. He would just start and go, and then by the time he's done, he had this. And so you're going to see the creative process. I haven't cut anything. You can see back here behind me. That's the fabric we're going to be using. My point of inspiration was this panel. We're going to do a panel quilt because panel quilts are fairly quick and easy. So this is going to be the inspiration piece that we're starting with. And I chose this panel and the fabric that we'll be using simply because we have a lot of all of it. So if you really like how this goes together and you want to make one, buy the fabric and watch the video and you can make your own. But it's going to be fairly quick. We're just going to make a quick panel quilt. I've got an idea in my head where we're going. It's going to kind of take shape as we go so you can kind of see the creative process. And the best thing about this is I don't have Becky here to tell me how awful this is going, which is why it's called Sewing Badly with Brent. You're going to see when I do bad things, I'll be sure to let you know what I'm doing wrong. So if you're watching this to learn how to quilt, you'll know what not to do. Things to keep in mind. Everything we're going to do today, all you need is a rotary cutter. And like I always said, there's only two other rulers that I use for 90% of my quilts. This is a 8.5 by 24 inch ruler. You could do a 6.5 by 24 inch. I like 8.5 by 24 inch, but I find that the 24 inch by whatever is a great ruler for a kind of a good catch-all ruler for what we're doing. And then the other thing that we're going to need is my handy dandy favorite, easy angle. You could probably do today's project with a 4.5, but because I'm not really sure what exactly I'm doing, I'm going to use a 6.5 just in case I wish I had a 6.5 instead of a 4.5. So definitely an easy angle. That's pretty much all we need for tools. Rotary cutter, ruler, easy angle. I have my cutting board set up. I have a wool pressing mat set up. There's some fabric. There's a panel. I have a sewing machine. You're going to watch the magic happen in real time. Feel free to comment and tell me how awful this is or what you think as we do this, and I'll kind of walk through the steps so you can see how it is we do a quilt. With a little bit of luck, fingers crossed, in an hour I'll have a quilt made. All right, so first thing we want to do is we've got this panel. Now, this panel, one of the problems we have is that this panel, the portions are kind of funky. If you'll notice, it goes crosswise instead of most of the time it goes this way. And that presents a problem because the proportions of my quilt are going to be off a little bit because I like my quilts to be longer than they are wider. So the first thing I'm going to do, anytime I do a panel, I'm going to sew something to the top and bottom to kind of fix that. So I'm going to actually trim my panel. I'm just going to trim this bottom edge off. But what I'm going to do, because you'll notice it has this nice kind of, this interesting kind of border print, I'm going to try and save that for the most part because you know what? Why not leave it in our quilt? What I'm going to do is I'm cutting this border off, but I'm leaving a 1/4 inch of it on because that's where my seam allowance is going to be, so that I'm not going to take the 1/4 inch out of this actual border. I'm going to get my 1/4 inch out of this little bit of whiteness here. So all I'm going to do first thing is I'm just going to line up my ruler at the 1/4 inch on that line there. And I'm good, Danny. This is better on there. I did put a new blade in, so that's kind of nice.
Nice.
I'm just lining up again here on the 1/4 inch off the white, so that when I do my seam, I'm taking as little out of that border as I can, because I want to save what I can of that border because it's kind of a nice print. So take advantage of it. You know, sometimes you run into with prints. If you'll notice, you see how that line I went straight here and it's kind of a nice 1/4 inch, and all of a sudden goes like that. That is a function of the printing and the stretching of the fabric as they roll it on. So what I tend to do is I'm actually going to just kind of take that. I'm going to trim this down to a 1/4 inch off of there, and then I'm just going to kind of pull that back in as I sew to it so that it kind of fixes itself as we go. Because otherwise what we would end up with is a little white spot in that corner. And we're just going to repeat the same process for the top. All right, so all I'm doing is I'm just chopping that off to a 1/4 inch. It might be a little bit of a generous 1/4 inch, but I'm not too worried about it. I'll make up for it when I... So,
You just said you were gonna make up for it. What did you do wrong?
Right here, you see how I went a little too close to that edge there? My 1/4 inch kind of. I'm gonna sew it on there, and I'm not gonna worry about it because you're gonna get a 1/4 inch here, then a 1/4 inch there, and it'll disappear, and nobody will know. And if somebody does know, you can just be like, well,
It was free. What do you want?
only God's perfect, not me. That's the. What I want to do next is I'm gonna add a strip to the top and bottom. And what I'm going to do is add this print here because this is a nice large print, which means I can do a large strip. So what I want to do is we're about, I'm going to say 9 inches, we're about 9 inches wider than we are taller. So what I'm going to do is to make my life easy to get the proportions I want, I'm going to add a 9-inch strip to the top and bottom of this. And then after we get it sewn on, if we decide that it's too much, we can always cut it down a little bit. But that's part of the reason I'm using this print here is this is a nice wide print. So if we do a 9-inch strip out of this, it doesn't look crazy. If this was a solid black or something with a really small print like dots, you wouldn't want to go 9 inches because the smaller prints just don't translate well to a bigger piece. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to cut 2 9-inch strips out of this. And some of my bad sewing decisions go into how is, in the end result, is somebody really going to see that and know it other than me? And usually the answer is probably no. So I don't get too lost in it, but I do know that there are some really minute details that like master craftsmen will make sure they do to their quilts. But if you can't tell, that's not who I am. I just want to have a fun quilt. Here's a great example. You'll notice there's a little bit of a crease here where this was creased when it got rolled on the bolt. If I was a more thorough quilter, you see that little pleat right there? If I was a more thorough quilter, I would probably cut this and then press that after. But that's not who I am, so I'm just going to cut it and sew. But that is something. I am not a big advocate of pre-washing your fabric. I know that can get me shot in some circles. And I don't do a lot of pre-pressing either, but it does make sense. I will say that most of the time it's not a bad idea. Becky is a big fan of pre-treating, where you hit everything with like some starch or some light sizing and press everything once before you get going. That's not a bad idea. If you're going to get really precise, it's an extra step to me a lot of times. And for this quilt here, I don't see the reason to do it. But I'm not saying it's not a bad idea. So all we're going to do now is where we cut that 1/4 inch to the 1/4 inch of that border. What I'm going to do now is just sew. And because this is a panel, we're just going to go length of fabric. We didn't have to cut for length or anything because we're just going to go length and we'll trim it all off here in just a second. Now the other thing I'm going to do too, because I'm kind of trying to pay attention to where I'm sewing, but I'm not working too hard at it, I'm going to do this with the panel side on the top. So the panel side's up, so I can actually kind of see where we trimmed to that 1/4 inch line. So I can, as I'm sewing it, I might adjust my seam a little bit to make sure that I'm taking up that white spot so you don't get a white spot between the two pieces after it's sewn. We have the long arm out back, so we get a lot of quilts, and sometimes you get these quilts that are immaculately pieced, but they didn't cut the salvage off, and so you get like that one square with the salvage sticking out. Pro tip, I turned my iron on before I started sewing so that it'll be ready to go when it comes time to press. Something to be very aware of when you're sewing is I can get away with not worrying too much about my 1/4 inch because I'm just throwing something together right here. But if you get into those really intricate patterns, the 1/4 inch becomes very important because if you go too much or too little beyond your 1/4 inch, that first piece, then the next piece that you're going to go to it is affected by that. And so a bad seam allowance grows over time. So it's very important to get good at maintaining a good 1/4 inch seam if you plan on doing fancy quilting. So we're ironing. What I do to iron, the ironing versus pressing, that's a debate I'm not going to get into. Because I tend to iron, because this is what ironing is. You take your iron, and I'm ironing that open. You see how I'm pushing it around? If I was pressing it, I would just put it on the seam and let it be. That's pressing. That's ironing versus pressing. And I'm not, like I said, I'm not going to get into that debate. What I like to do is because I'm lazy, I'm just going to I'm just going to kind of hold this up a little bit so I can see my seam on the back side, then I'm just pressing that over onto the seam. So that way all of my seams go the same direction and I didn't have to work too hard to get them to go that way. The other thing that you'll run into with pressing sometimes, some people like to press the back first. If you press the back first, that you might get a pleat where that comes over like that and it's not fully open. So that's something to be aware of. I see this a lot because it'll get ironed like that, so then that gets sewn like that and you've actually got a little bit of a pleat there. So that's why I like to do it. As you can see where I've got the seam right there, and then just by pushing this fabric over with the iron gives me a nice pressed seam, all going in the same direction without the risk of having that pleat thing happen. So now you can see with the top and bottom on, the proportions of this panel are a lot better. That now, if we make this bigger, the proportions are right. It's not going to be too wide versus too long. So now all I'm going to do the same thing we did on the other side. I'm going to actually cheat it a little bit further. Actually, you know what? Yeah, we'll make it a little bit further in, just because that's what we're going to do. We're going to bring it in probably close to 1/8, just so I don't have to worry about it too much. But same idea. I'm going to not cut all of that white off. I'm going to use that for part of my seam allowance. Now, when you do this, the important thing, I probably should line this up and show this before you started, is when I line this up, I've got a ruler, and across the top here, I've got a straight line that's square with the edge. So I am just going to line this line up with the edge of this here to make sure, I say that and I'm not, to make sure I've got a square corner here. Because if I start getting wonky here, that wonkiness just continues again through the rest of the quilt, and that looks pretty good. So I'm just going to work my way down. I used to say, anytime somebody would come in and say, I saw you on YouTube, I'd always say, I'm sorry.
Well, I'm glad you don't apologize.
Not anymore. I'm like, yeah, isn't Becky great? And like I said, I'm just leaving a little bit of that, about 1/8 of an inch of that salvage, just so that it comes into our seam allowance, so we can get more of the border off the panel. But I don't want, and see, I kind of screwed this up because I lined up my seam allowance with here. So I've got to be careful when I put this side border on that I don't have any of the salvage of this showing. And if you'll notice, I haven't measured anything yet except 9-inch strips, because that's how this is going to be. Not going to be a lot of measuring. It's going to be like happy little trees, little happy trees here, little cloud there. And you can see if you'd fussy cut the strips to line them up, that might look a little different, top and bottom. Or I could have flipped them around. I don't know. But I like the way it's coming out, so I'm going to keep going. One of the driving forces behind this project is I was trying to, like I said, use fabric that we'd have plenty of. So if you see this and like, I got to have one of these, we have plenty of the fabric. And one of the other things we have a lot of in this store is basics. So this is part of the Fossil Fern collection, which comes in a variety of different colors, but it has a really nice texture as it relates to what we're doing here. So if you look at that color and that texture, looks really good next to our panel. So I had some Fossil Fern because the next thing I want to do now that I've got this centerpiece made is I'm now just going to frame this. Because I feel like I want a little bit of a frame before I go crazy with my border. Now, what you could do from here, if you're being really simple, is just throw a couple borders on it and call it done. But that's not what we're going to do. We're going to keep it more exciting than that. Even though this is going to be put together badly, it's going to be more exciting than that. But what I do want to do is I want to frame this out real quick, because if I start adding a pieced border or whatnot to it, it's going to all kind of blend together, because my plan is to use these animal prints in some blocks to go around the border. And what'll happen is if I don't put something between the two, I think you're going to lose a lot of that. You're going to lose some definition, and they're going to kind of bleed into each other. So I'm going to use this Fossil Fern here and just do a real kind of a small frame around everything. And I am thinking, just off the top of my head, I'm going to go with 2 inches. 2 inches with a 1/4 inch seam is going to finish out to 1.5 inches.
More than enough.
More than enough. And again, after I get it put on there, if I'm like, yeah, that doesn't look good, then I will just cut it smaller. But I think 2 inches is probably a pretty good spot to do that. So what we're going to do is cut 6 strips altogether. I think 6 strips should be plenty to do all 4 sides. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 fell on the ground, and I told you we needed 6. And if you're keeping track of yardage, the panel is 1. Then we did 2 9-inch strips. What's 2 times 9? 18. What is 18?
Half a yard.
Half a yard. So we have half a yard for the first border, and then we just cut 6 times 2 is 12. So we're up to a 1/3 yard for the accent. Now we're going to be cutting more of this, but I'm just kind of keeping track of this for you. If it's something that if you're actually paying attention and think you're going to make a quilt similar to this. The other thing I always do whenever I cut strips is after I get the strips cut, one of the first things I always do is I cut the salvage off. Now, I will oftentimes cut the salvage off first before I strip it if I have my yardage pre-cut. Now, the other thing we're going to do real quick, because we have to piece these, one of the things that I like to do is I like to piece on a 45. What you're going to find is that if we piece these to just butt end them together, I don't know if that's the correct term for sewing, but that's what they would call it if you were splicing wires. That would be a butt connection.
I actually just did that the other day. I butted my ruler up together.
Yeah. So a lot of times to piece it, you just sew these together and call it good. The reason I don't like to do that is the straight line is a lot more jarring when you're looking at it. If you sew a straight line, then that straight seam is like, oop, there it is on the corner. I like to piece any of my borders. I like to piece usually at a 45, just so it breaks that line up a little bit, so so it doesn't jump out as much at you. And all I'm doing is putting those 2 pieces perpendicular. This is where the magic of the easy angle comes in. I'm going to line that up. It says 2 and 2, and I'm just going to chop that off.
Good point, Jean.
What's that?
She says it's also less bulk.
Yes, on bindings you definitely want to piece at a 45 because you get less bulk as you start to fold stuff over. On your border, it's not as important for the bulk factor, but there is an aesthetic thing to it that I like, which is why I tend to do it. That's the pivot function, how that just came up, because I'm doing now what they call chain stitching. So what's nice about the pivot function is that just comes right up. This is one of those functions like power windows in your car that once you get a machine that does it, see how that just came up and I didn't have to touch anything?
With needle down.
With the needle down. That is a fantastic function if you're going to do a lot of chain piecing. But I only need to do those 2 pieces and I'm going to stop. But once you get used to that, you really can't go back to something else. It's very hard. Use my fat little fingers to open the seam and knock it down. That's all I'm going to do there. I'm sure we could get deeper into why we do things the way we do, but that works for me. And I'm just going to do the same thing on here. Now, what I typically, there's 4 sides, but I'm only doing these 2 pieces to do my to do the left and the right side. I'm not going to do the top and bottom because I'm not going to do top and bottom because I'm going to take what's left over from this to sew to this so that my top and bottom pieces are long enough. Same thing I did last time. I'm going to do it with the panel side up again, just because of how we cut that, cut the salvage to leave that 1/4 inch. So I want to make sure that I can see that as I'm going. The other thing I'm going to do too is I'm not going to line this straight up with that. I'm going to leave a little bit extra because I'm just going to trim that anyway. So I like to leave myself a little extra for when I trim it. And so that's going to go there.
I just answered John's question for you.
What was John's question?
Are we going to see Brent free motion this quilt next week?
If you really want to see a bad
we
idea,
do not.
no, I'll probably get it. If I get this done today, I will get it thrown on the long arm, and you'll get to see it next week. Yes, but I'm not. Yeah, I am still trying. If Christine, if you're watching, I'm still trying to get Christine in here to start covering a little bit of free motion because she is an absolute superstar when it comes to free motion quilting, and I would love to get her in here to kind of give us some of her tips and tricks. It's a skill, and it's also kind of an art because I think you can learn with free motion. You can learn the techniques, like painting. You can learn the technique of painting, but practice and some natural ability is what's going to set the average free motion quilter apart from the superstars. There is definitely a bit of a natural ability I think that goes with it that I don't know that. I mean, maybe you can make up for it in practice, but I really think there's an art to it that can't be taught. You can learn the basics, and then, like I said, it's kind of like painting. I know color theory, and I know a little bit about the basics of technique, but I am an awful artist. Versus somebody, some people have the ability, and then with a little bit of instruction and a little bit of knowledge, they can take it to a whole nother level. And so what you're going to find is the truly fantastic free motion quilters have that natural ability coupled with knowledge. But everybody can get the knowledge and get passable at it with practice. Well, something interesting, while I'm doing this, and we'll talk about that, is I heard something fascinating once that really struck me. Like, everybody knows, like, Mozart and Beethoven, and those guys are we'll use Mozart as an example. Like, when you think of classical music and all-time musical greats, name Mozart pops right up. Do you know how many pieces of music that he composed in his lifetime? It's in the thousands.
What is it?
It's thousands and thousands of pieces of music is what Mozart composed in his lifetime. And this is actually probably true for most famous classical composers. Thousands of pieces of music. Do you know how many of those pieces of music actually still get played today?
2.
It's like less than 20. I mean, I think it's 50 at the top end, but recognizable, it's under 10. So that is kind of an example of, if you want to be great, sometimes it's just the sheer amount of work you do is what makes you great.
Yeah.
Not to say that Mozart wasn't great in his own right, but the catalog of work that he has that we draw from and how little of it we actually still use today or we still listen to is quite astounding. But that's how you become great. You throw enough stuff at the wall, something's got to stick. And all I'm doing now is I'm just doing the same thing. I'm just going to iron this out.
Which is bad.
What do you mean by set the seam? You flip it over first?
You press the seam while it's still folded,
Yeah.
so that when you flip it over, it holds the stitch easier because it relaxes it and maybe doesn't get stretched as much when you do what you're doing. It's driving me crazy.
See,
Becky's rubbed off on me.
I know. But you see, this is one of those things that I've never known anything different because the amount of actual classes I've taken on quilting, and I'm not going to lie, is I think 2.
Yeah.
And even those, I'm not sure that they really count as classes, as more sales pitches. So,
Okay.
all right.
Are you going to explain what you did wrong?
What I did wrong where?
You're stretching out the. Never mind.
Am I stretching out of when I sew this?
Well, when you're doing that, aren't you making it like wonky?
No, not really.
Huh?
Maybe a little bit, but it's not something you really have to. The wonkiness you don't have to worry about a super lot if you're going cross grain. If I was on a bias cut, the way that I was ironing of just pushing it out on a bias cut would certainly be a lot worse. But because we're we have a cross grain and not a bias cut, it's not that big of a deal because the fabric is pretty stable in the direction that we're ironing in. Years ago, I had this idea for a book I was going to write, and it was going to be like how to quilt, and all I was going to talk about is quilt Nazis, because there's all sorts of stuff out there that's like, you can't do it this way, you do it this way and you're wrong, and I'm going to let you all in a secret. You're watching me sew awful, because you know what? I have fun sewing. That is the proper way to quilt, is to have fun. You can certainly add to the experience by making something decent when you're done. But if you're having fun while you're doing it, doesn't matter. That's the proper way to quilt. So if they say, don't do it, and you don't really care and you're having a good time, then you're quilting right. That's all I'm going to say.
That's true.
There's all sorts of those. Like, there used to be a big thing about, you can't mix, can't use polyester thread on cotton fabric. Have you ever heard that one?
Yeah.
Yep. And like, well, why not? Because you're going to cut your fabric with the polyester thread.
I never heard that. But
You've never heard that, but that's one of the reasons. If you use polyester thread, you could cut through your fabric while you're sewing.
Huh.
Yeah, well, that's not true. Because if you're cutting through your fabric when you're sewing, you have a tension problem. It's got nothing to do with the thread.
I guess I never knew why people said that.
Well, that was one of them. There's all sorts of interesting old wives' tales. Well, it's kind of fun because the other one that I absolutely love, I'm doing this. One of the other things I absolutely love is I help people pick colors all the time for their, and all I'm doing is these are not going to be the top borders, is I help people all the time pick colors for quilts. And one of my favorite things is they're looking for colors, and you pull a new color out. You're like, you know what? I bet this blue would look really good in there. And my favorite answer is, well, I can't because there's no blue in the quilt. And I feel like saying, well, that's why we're going to put the blue in. It's got none yet. There's no there's no law that says you can't do it. And I see that a lot, like with borders. People are always afraid to put a new color in the borders. But why? Why worry about it? It's your quilt. If you like it and it's going to look good, there's no law against it. There's no universal law of quilting that says, well, you can only have, you can't add colors in the border, or better have the same colors that are in your main print. No, if it looks good, go with it. There's no real wrong way to quilt.
We're all saying that right now.
Yeah, and honestly, there's a lot of stuff that I do wrong, and I know that. But it's not important enough for me to fix it. Now, as I get older and the more of this I do, there are some things that I do differently because I like the results better by doing it the proper way. But that's not everything, because there's some stuff, the return on investment isn't worth it. The time it takes to do it properly versus for me to half-ass it. I'd rather just half-ass it because, you know what, I'm having fun. One thing to keep in mind when you're throwing on borders, because again, I'm doing it wrong, because you really should, if you wanted to do this properly, is to have measured these out, measured your quilt, and then figure out how long they're supposed to be and cut them and then make them fit. I don't do that because, again, I'm kind of lazy, but that can make for a very wavy and wonky quilt. And the reason being is the inner portion is stretching more than the outer portion as you're sewing it together, and then it all kind of comes back together. So one thing you always want to make sure of, if you're not going to measure your borders and be sloppy like I'm doing right here, is make sure that your quilt itself is well supported, that it's not off the back of the table, it's not being pulled on the front, because the weight of the quilt will cause that border to stretch enough that you'll get some little bit of wonkiness in the borders as you're going. And like I said, there's ways around it to fix that, but again, as we were talking about quilting badly with Brent, the lazy solution that I have had good success with is to just make sure that you are not pulling or pushing that top, and it should feed through at an even rate and you should be fine. That's not to say I always have the best luck with borders. Sometimes they will come out a little wonky on me. But if you are somebody that really wants to have good borders, you want to measure out the quilt. You measure the two sides in the middle, take the average, and that's how long your borders need to be. And then you sew them, and then you cut your borders to length and sew them on that way. That is proper borders. What I just did is not proper borders. It's not even close to proper borders. See, the problem is doing this sort of show of like how awful I am at sewing. It's kind of a reflection of my personality. So they get an idea of
in your work habit.
So they get an idea of what really goes on behind the scenes if you pay attention to how this is going together. All right.
It takes a village.
We got the inner border on. Now I'm going to get to the part that's kind of interesting. Maybe I'll just do one side so you can see how it's going to go, and not all four sides.
There you go.
So you all get the idea of the gist of it without having to sit through an entire afternoon of me rambling.
Over a sewing machine.
Yeah, over a sewing machine. But that's what's nice. But did you notice how quiet the Luminaire is, that we can kind of talk over it and it's still not awful?
It's definitely better than some of the others I've had.
Yes. So that's a selling point for the Luminaire, how quiet it is.
That and the bobbin area. I don't have to get a screwdriver out.
And the fact that it has a pivot function. See, we're going to tell you all the wonderful things about a Luminaire. We're not even talking about the embroidery side of it, just the sewing side. Those are the features that you get.
Sewing. It's awesome.
Yeah, that's all we're doing right now is sewing.
I love the big
these
throw
borders,
area too.
The fact that I'm kind of doing this really quick in front of everybody, these borders are wonky.
I've been saying that. See, you never listen to me.
Well, it becomes very obvious when you start to iron them out or press them, as the case may be.
No, you're ironing and you're switching and.
No, but it's got nothing to do with the ironing. It's the fact that I haven't sewn a straight line yet.
was trying to help.
My seams are
trying.
all over the world, all over the place.
I hope Becky doesn't watch us.
And all I'm doing when I square this up again, I am just kind of lining this up there, kind of lining that up with there, and I kind of get the same thing on the inner border. That's just to make sure I've got square corners. So, like I said, most of the time when you do a panel, you just throw a couple borders on it and call it good. But I was like, no, people want something a little more fancy than that. So we're now going to add a little bit of pizzazz to the borders, to this last border that we're going to put on. We're actually going to put 2 more borders on. We're going to put a border, a little bit of a pieced border next, and then we're going to follow that up with another 2-inch strip of this dark brown, so that pieced border kind of sits inside the dark brown and really gives it a little bit of interest. So, what do we got so far? Because one of the problems with pieced borders, I'm going to show you some really neat cheating tricks, is that once you start piecing the border, you have to do a lot of math
Blech.
to get the pieces to line up with your edge. Do you see what I'm saying?
Everybody just laughed.
No, but they're going to want to see this. They're going to be like, my gosh, this is genius. Okay, first off, let's make the pieces for our border. I was going to make some pinwheels or 4 square blocks out of these animal prints.
Interesting.
Yeah, I don't know how it's going to look. See, the problem with doing this live is if it starts to get ugly, I got to go with it because I started it. All right, this is where it's going to get fun. This is where the oh my gosh, what am I watching is going to come out. So I'm going to start. Let's see, how big do we want our square? How big do we want those squares to be? I'm going to go 6.5. 6.5 sounds like it'll be good.
Sounds great.
And all I'm going to do is cut a 6.5-inch strip. We'll just do one to start. So we're going to cut this one at 6.5. And then I'm trying to decide, do I want to do pinwheels or 4 patches? Like I said, I had the idea for this a long time ago, but I was like, I don't know if I could sustain this, and I don't know that people would want to tune in for an hour every week or hour and a half to watch me make a mess. So now what I'm doing is I'm taking these 6.5-inch strips, if you're watching, as we ramble, and I'm cutting them into 6.5-inch squares. Now this trick I'm about to show you works awesome for layer cakes. But because we don't have layer cakes, I'm doing 6.5 because I don't have to do 10. But when you see what I'm about to do, you will find that with layer cakes, this works great. We may have demoed this once already on here. I don't know. So all I'm going to do now is take these squares. I'm going to take one of those squares and one of my cheetah squares. What are those? Are those like leopards or what are those? I don't know my animal prints.
I don't know.
And I'm going to take that one there, and I'm going to sew it together. But I screwed up when I made this, and the bottom one's a little bit bigger than the one on top. I don't care. What are you laughing at?
Nothing.
This is the reality.
I know.
This is like real quilting. This isn't theoretical quilting. This is how people actually quilt. Because I would submit, this is how 90% of most people sew, is the mess I'm making right here. All I'm doing right now is I'm just going to... Probably.
You think it's that high?
Maybe not quite that high. But I think everybody was at this point at some point before they realized that maybe I should be a little bit more of a craftsman and not so much of a hack.
A cheetah quilt.
Who came up with that one?
Gene.
That's a good one. I'm just chaining these through.
See, even Gene says John would have a hard time something like you right now.
Yeah, well, what you'll actually find, this is very interesting if you look at, men tend to be much more precise when it comes to quilting.
Yeah.
They tend to be more like an engineer, like they want everything lined up perfectly, like their cutting is always perfect, and it's a very interesting difference in right brain versus left brain people, and men versus women. I mean, I'm stereotyping, and I know I'm not allowed to do that anymore, but I think our demographic, I'm safe to make
You're
those.
fine.
I think I'm safe to make those assumptions in the target demographic. So all I'm going to do now is I just chain those through, but you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to keep sewing these sides on. So I just sewed one side on there. I'm just going to turn it around, sew the other side.
Now, are you going to sew the whole thing or just the 2 sides?
I'm going to sew the whole thing.
So you have to sew all the way around.
Yeah, so I'm going to sew all the way around.
Did you know that Gene and John have different studios in the house?
I did not know that. That's probably why they still like each other.
Well, I want to know who's the Becky and who's the Brent.
No, I read an article years ago about again, being in a quilting magazine, that they're very biased towards female viewership, which if you look at our YouTube stats, it says women watch us. But anyway, the article I read said don't let your husband learn to quilt because he'll steal all your stuff. And I thought it was really kind of funny.
That is funny.
And if you're a man and you're thinking about getting into sewing, remember this is an industrial thread injector. It's not a sewing machine.
Wait,
I'm gonna need a couple more.
What foot you're using?
I'm just using a 1/4 inch foot.
That's the 1/4 inch of the foot?
Yeah.
The guide?
Yeah, 1/4 inch guide. But if you're looking at my seams, you're probably thinking it's not much of a 1/4 inch foot.
Now you can show off my binding.
You're binding? Oh, if I want to feel good about myself, I can certainly show his binding off. I was gonna. He didn't even ask like for help. He just comes back like, look, I got my quilt bound. I'm like, do you know how to do a binding? He's like, I do now. Look closely because it is debatable that he knows how to do a binding now.
What?
All this right here is Eddie's binding. He was attaching it by a machine. So I would submit that no, he does not know how to do a binding yet. Yeah, see, but here's Eddie's quilt. And I thought this came out really neat though. This is just something he threw together off of that panel that Danny was trying to get rid of. And for all you ladies that are watching, Eddie's single.
Woo!
Woo-wee! Probably the wrong demographic for you, Eddie, but you know, I was trying.
Well, they're grandchildren.
I wouldn't mind the sugar mom.
All right, so all I'm going to do now, are we doing 4 patches or do we want to do pinwheels? Pinwheels, okay, we'll do pinwheels. All I'm going to do now is I sold all 4 sides of these. You guys got to watch that painful experience as I was doing it. And all I'm going to do now is I'm going to take one of these and I'm going to line up on my seam lines where they intersect at the 2 corners and chop it just like that. Ba-boom.
Ba-boom.
Now, if you're really good, you can like keep it all together and do that, but I find it easier just to then go like this and find my 45 mark. I'm rotating mat. But the other thing you can do is just line up straight across the bottom here and go through the top there on the corner. That's all you're trying to do. Now, the reason this works so good for layer cakes is because you get 4 of the same half square triangles when you're done. And let me just, so if you have, so in a layer cake, you get a bunch of different prints. So it's very hard to get some structure to the quilt because you've got like 40 different prints. But you can get these pinwheels very easily because you just need 2 squares. As long as the 2 squares you start with are the same, and well, they're going to be the same because they're, you know, the prints that you start with, you get 4 pieces out of it to make a pinwheel with the 2 fabrics you started with. And I'm just cutting off the dog ears. This is one of those things that I have learned that even though I'm lazy and normally when I started out my quilting career, I never would have bothered with this because I'm like, it's just an extra step. But I have learned that extra step gives me better results that I'm happier with. So therefore, it's worth my time to cut off my dog ears. And you can see just how wonky these pieces are, how wonky this pinwheel is going to be. Oh, it's going to be glorious. So now all I'm going to do is make a pinwheel. Oh, that's how we do a pinwheel. So we're just going to take those 4 pieces that we got out of one, and
Right,
I'm having a brain fart.
I know, right? You can't, can you? It's those colors you picked.
Oh, there we go. That one's got to be changed there, and then if we go there. How's that look?
John started a new hashtag for you.
What's it called?
So awful quilting with Brent.
So there you go. I'll own it. I'll own that. And I screwed up. If I had been smart, I would have pressed that seam in the same direction on all cases. But on one of these, I pressed it in the wrong direction. So I'm just no. Actually, I did press them all in the right direction. Good for me. All right. So here is our first block for our pieced border.
Yeah. See.
Yeah. See.
It's better that way.
It's better that way, little pinwheel. See, and then what you're going to see is I'll show you. You can kind of get an idea what this is going to look like now. Is that's going to be set in here like that, next to that, and we're going to have these blocks floating in between some of that background fabric. So I need to make, let me make these last 4, and we'll get this first border done. And you'll all be like, wow, that was amazing. So all we're gonna do now is finish these up, because once we get the blocks made, I can throw that border on in no time. Because I wanna show you how to do the border, so you don't have to worry about the math, how to figure out how wide to make it. That's the trick when you're working with panels a lot of time, is how wide do you make the separate portions of it so that it all looks right. And so like when you're doing a pieced border like this, do you wanna sit down and figure out, oh my gosh, how many blocks do I need to make so that it fits precisely along the edge of that border? And I'm going to tell you right now that that is not something I'm going to figure out. What was...
Carrie says the way you're rushing, definitely getting in your cardio.
Okay, so I fell down, I fell down the Reddit hole.
Ooh.
Because I was like doing my research on how to market crap. And they're like, well, get in user groups on Reddit. Reddit is fantastic when it comes to like quilting and sewing.
Really?
Some of the stuff I'm running into, well, because it's a different demographic, because it's a much younger crowd, so the questions some of them are kind of funny to me. But some of the stuff they're doing is pretty cool. But it's a different type of person that goes on Reddit. I mean, so now that I've got them laid, see, I like to lay them out before I start sewing to make sure that I'm going to sew everything correctly. Because it's very easy when you start doing this sort of thing to, see, the reason I like to cut the dog ears off, if you look, is they get caught under your 1/4 inch seam and they give a little too much bulk to the edge there.
Got quiet off of that.
I know. It's that, what's the science behind that? Is what, every 7 to 8 minutes there's a long conversation? Did you know that there's like an actual...
No, when my son and I we've discussed this, like we'll be in the middle of a conversation. When we start talking about kids and dogs, it's time to go.
Oh, why?
That means we're out of things to talk about.
But those are probably the most interesting things to talk about.
They are for me.
Yes.
My dogs.
Okay. I'm gonna admit to some stuff right now.
Excellent. We all need to hear it.
Well, I hope that people that come to the store don't watch this and think I don't like them.
Don't judge us.
And this is, and now that I'm a dog person, I get it, okay? But you ever have somebody that opens their phone up and look how cute my dog is, and you're like, I don't want to see your damn dog.
Are you trying to tell me something?
No, I'm just saying, you know what I'm saying? And the same with like baby pictures, like, oh, look at how cute my niece is or whatever. It's like, it's not my kid, so I don't care. But, you know, as I get older, I actually appreciate it more, is all I'm trying to say. When I was younger, I'm like, why do you think I want to see this?
Well, we have somebody in the store that shows me grandchildren pictures all the time. And the deal is, okay, but you know the rule. I get to take out mine and show you my dogs.
Yeah.
And that's the rule.
That's fine. And while we're talking about things that drive us nuts, I know I've harped on this before, but I think it needs to be repeated, especially now that we're in wedding season. Mm-hmm. People that get married, if you're thinking about getting married and you're planning your wedding, if you truly love your friends, you will not do it on a Saturday afternoon.
That's a good point. I really wish people would do that.
Yeah, because why would you get married on a Saturday afternoon? You waste everybody else's afternoon. I mean, we're happy for you that you're getting married. Yay for you, you're married. But I only have 52 Saturdays in a year. And then you probably only have a quarter of that in the summer with good weather. And you're going to waste one on a wedding? I mean, like I said, yay for you, you're getting married. Send me the video. I'll watch it if it makes you feel better. If you really love your friends, you will get married on a Friday afternoon. You know why? Because then you get to take work off. Yeah. People that are going to come to your wedding, they have to get the Friday afternoon off. They're like, I got to go to a wedding on Friday afternoon. So they get like an extra long weekend because they're taking, they might go to work Friday morning and they get Friday afternoon off. So they're not wasting their entire week. In fact, they get a longer weekend because of your wedding. They don't lose the weekend because of your wedding. Saturday afternoon, can't do anything before the wedding because you got to get cleaned up and take a shower to go to the wedding, so you don't want to get dirty before. And then it gets done like at 6 o'clock, and so the night's already over. Why do that to your friends? That's all I'm saying. If you're going to get married on a Friday.
Jean says on a Wednesday. I say any holiday.
Wednesday's not a holiday?
Yes, because their anniversary for them will always be at the
Yeah, but that's not fair to the rest of us because then we got to waste a holiday to go to your wedding.
Not necessarily. Just don't go.
Yeah, but you go because you feel obligated. You can't just not go to a wedding that you're invited to. Okay. I mean, you know that you're only invited. Really? Yeah.
They only want my present.
I know. We all know that's true, but at the same time, there's that weird social need to go to the wedding.
Kaya, you sound like my soulmate. I swear.
What did she say?
Said, no friends, no wedding, more sewing time.
Exactly. But if you stick to my plan, you wouldn't have friends because they'd stop inviting. Oh, you're not going to come to my wedding anyway. But the fact that you make quilts means you're everybody's friend because they want that quilt for their wedding.
Yep. Or baby shower.
Yep.
Or
or whatever.
Or whatever.
And don't do it. Don't make that mistake and make the first one, because everybody's going to expect it after that.
I got 3 baby quilts. I never made a baby quilt, and then I'll have to make 3. That's crazy.
We all know how you feel about your baby. Your granddaughter's coming.
Let's
your
not
grandkid.
talk about it on TV.
On air because it would make really good television.
No, it would not.
All right, so here we go. We've got 4 pinwheels, and what I'm going to do now is we know. Let me just measure these real quick and get an idea how wide they are, because we have no idea what our mat looks like at this point. So all I'm going to do now is throw these bad boys on my cutting mat and see that we'll call them 8 inches. So all we're going to do is we cut the first strips at 2 inches. So I'm going to take. So we have what? So we're going to need 3 8-inch strips. You'll see the method to the madness here in just a second. So we're just going to take these leftovers that we had from the first strip. We might have to cut more, but I'm just going to cut. I think I got enough to get this portion done. And 8 inches. Remember that number. That number is going to be important here in a minute. What?
Nothing.
You don't think it's going to be important? Okay. So now all we're going to do is we're just going to take our blocks. You're kind of following along so you can watch the visual. I'm just going to sew these 2 inches in between all of my blocks. I remember years ago I worked for a call center, and the lady that was the trainer was an ex-cheerleader stewardess. And her thing was fake it till you make it. She says, say it with a smile and say it with enthusiasm, and I believe you know what you're talking about. This was in a call center for a bank. And I always thought that was great advice in life. You know, say it with enthusiasm and like you know what you're talking about, and you know what? It gets you by. And that's how I learned to quilt. I've been faking it till I make it here for so long that you're now watching. You're watching me on YouTube, thinking I actually know what I'm doing. And the other thing I know is I have an allergy to pins, so we're not going to be doing a lot of pinning. But this technique does require 1 pin before we're done.
I want to see the math part.
There is no math. I told you that.
I thought you said there was math involved.
No, I told you we're taking the math out of it. There can be a little bit of math. I'm going to show you a little bit of math just in case you know if you want to save fabric. But the only reason for the math is so you don't use as much fabric. All right. So look at this. Look at our border. Look at that. Isn't that weird? Looks kind of funny on television. All right. Let me just iron that real quick, and then you're going to see some of the magic happen. Now, what was the number we were supposed to remember on our width?
8.
8 is correct. That border is going to go right down the side here, so you can kind of see what this is going to look like. Now, because we don't want to do a lot of math and figure all this out, all we're going to have to do now is figure out, so that's folded in half there, and you can see that if we put this border on here, you see how much shorter we are here. Now, we could probably throw, from the looks of it, actually, if we did another block, it would look good there, but then the problem you're going to have if you did do another block is your top isn't going to line up right. So all I'm going to do for this quilt, because this is how I was planning to do this originally, is I'm going to take a piece of this, sew that there, and then cut it even. And we're going to make sure that this is kind of centered on the side, and it'll look like a really nice border like we meant to do it this way. So here's where the math comes in. I'm going to line that up kind of like that, and I'm going to throw a ruler on it and measure. And that says 12 inches. But we know that 12 is going to be cutting it close, figured seam allowances. So we're going to go 14 inches. So 14 inches. And what was our magic number?
8.
8. So we need 2 pieces that are 8 by 14. So there's an 8-inch strip. And then I said I needed 2 14-inch pieces out of that. I'm not even going to bother cutting the salvage off because that's going to get trimmed off anyway. So I'm just going to go like that and cut that at 14. I'm going to throw that off to the side. We'll probably end up using it later. And then I'm just going to sew this to the ends of my border. Have I gone on too long? See, I think I did go on too long. I should have stopped at an hour and finished this up later. But how's it go?
You didn't listen to me, so again.
Well, there's a lot to do.
I have witnesses this time.
I know, but I wanted to show you how this is going to work. So if I never get back to this for some reason, you can all see what the idea was. And you can reference it and then extrapolate from what you see now and do this on the other 4 sides, and you'll be like, oh, it makes sense. And then I can also see if my pinwheel my cheetah pinwheels are going to be worth it, because it might be god awful and I'll take this border out because I'm like, yeah, pinwheels were a bad idea. But we'll see here in just a second. All right. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take this quilt. I'm going to fold it in half on the side where I'm going to attach my border, like so. And then I'm going to hunt down a pin, because I know I have one here somewhere, and mark the center point. Fold it in half, and I'm marking the center point. Marking the center point. Eddie is texting instead of watching the screen, so he could not zoom in and see me put a pin in the center point. All right, we're going to do the same thing here. We're going to take this, fold it in half, and mark the center point. And it's kind of a sad center point, because, oh, there we go, okay. So we fold it in half, we're going to take a pin, mark the center points, right? So far so good. Then we take the other center point that we just marked over here. 2 pins, not just 1, 2. I'm sure there's lots of people that aren't happy about that. And all I'm going to do is line these 2 pins up like that. See, I got them lined up. Can you see on there? The 2 pins are lined up. And all I'm going to do now, because that's the center point of both my edges, I'm just going to start in that center point with those 2 pins lined up, and sew in one direction or the other. Doesn't matter which direction, just pick a direction and go. If you're really a persnickety person, you could actually pin everything and then sew one line later. But we have all established that that is not me. So I'm just going to start sewing down. And I'm just going to sew it right off the edge of the quilt. Second. Now, after I come off this end, and then I'm just going to pull my 2 pins out because I don't want to sew them, go back to where we started sewing, and go in the opposite direction. Now, what this is doing for us is it's taking that pieced border that we have, lining it up to the center of the panel, so it almost looks like we meant to do it that way. But we are going to have a little bit more space on the edges because we didn't feel like trying to figure exactly how big to make the squares so it filled the border properly. And what will happen is, if you do this same thing on the top and bottom, you'll get a really nice, there's a couple things you could do, but I like the way it turns out because you just get this kind of cool floating pieced border with this really nice kind of a dark corner that frames it really nice. You'll see what I'm talking about here in just a second. Maybe, if it comes out semi-close to what I want to do.
So you're gonna cut some of it off, though.
Yeah. But you see, when I added a couple inches, because I thought I only needed like 12 inches, but I went a little long. And let me actually iron it out real quick, and you'll see what I'm talking about. But I went a little long on purpose so that I could trim some off, so that it's going to be so that I covered the full length. Because there's nothing worse than doing this and coming up like a ½ inch short on the edge, and you're like, dang it. And then, like, I've done it, and you could just kind of stretch it and make it work. I have done that. But it's much easier to give yourself a couple extra inches and just cut it off after. And my ultimate plan is, after I get the other 3 sides done, let me just get this out, and we're going to call this quits here today, because I think we got to the point where you can all see how the rest of this goes together. Because we're just going to repeat the same pinwheel process. We're going to, and like I said, all I'm going to do here again is I'm lining that up so it's square there and there. And I'm just going to cut that off, save it in my scraps. I might have use for it later. That is 8 inches, and it's going to be more than 2 inches, so we could actually probably put that between a couple blocks as a sashing if we wanted to. But now you can kind of see how that's going to look.
Oh, I gotcha.
What I'm going to do next is I want to finish this, we're going to take another 2-inch strip of this here and put that on the outside, so that our pinwheel blocks are kind of floating. Do you see what we're doing here? And then what you're going to be, because I didn't really care about the math for this corner, when we put the top on, this dark brown is going to wrap all the way around the top of the corner, so it'll frame it kind of nicely. And I'll probably do 3 blocks across this top instead of 4 to try and keep the, okay. I'll probably do 3 blocks across the top instead of 4 so that this space here is fairly consistent over to this side here, so it doesn't look too funky. But we could have probably put another block here if we wanted to, but I didn't want to figure that out or fight with the math. We're just going to go with that, and then we're going to have that same portion across the top here, so you have this nice looking corner, and you have these pieced borders, and that's what we're going to do. And then, like I said, we're going to do a final outer border is going to be of this black again, so that these pinwheels kind of float in the border. But that was the general idea. Like I said, I've gone way over. And if we were going to finish it, I'd probably need another couple hours. But you can get the concept of what we just did there and how there was no math involved to get that border. The way you're avoiding your math is just, estimating the length of this piece here, that filler strip, so that you can adjust that so you're not, you don't have to have a perfect amount. The other place you can also adjust that if you want is we could have made these filler strips a little bit bigger if we wanted to flush that out, if we wanted to get a little bit more even spacing. But I really did feel like I said I didn't want to do a lot of math. I just wanted to kind of throw it together, and that's the trick to it. You don't have to do math. You just get it where it looks good, then you lay out your filler strips, and then you pin in the middle, and so in either direction, then you get a nice, looking pieced border without a whole lot of, without driving yourself nuts trying to figure out exactly how big to make it. So that's what we had for today. I hope you all enjoyed it. Like I said, there's a lot of awful sewing in there. I'm sure some of you had to look away and cringe at some of the stuff that you were witnessing. But that's just a quick, easy quilt. Repeat the process of that last border 3 more times for your other borders, and then throw a outer border onto that same black, and you're done. And then it comes out nice. The proportions on it are nice. That's just a quick, easy way to use panels. You can use any panel you want. If you want to make this exact quilt, we've got the fabric here. I was hoping to get it done so you could all look at it and say, ooh, I'm going to make that quilt. But I'll try and have it done for next week so you can all see what it turns out like. I'm not going to bore you with more sewing because you saw the basic concept of what we're going with there. So I appreciate you all watching. I hope I didn't bore you all too much, and I hope you all maybe learned something and had a good laugh at my expense. And thanks for watching. Sew on and be excellent to each other.